I want you to try something. Tonight, after dark not now, tonight go to the nearest mirror in your house. Switch off every light in the room. Leave only one candle burning, somewhere behind you. Then sit down about 2 feet from the glass and stare at your own reflection for 10 minutes without looking away. Don't blink more than you have to. Just stare. Within 60 seconds, most people begin to notice something they cannot immediately explain. Their face starts to change, the edges blur, the features shift. Some people see their face age rapidly, wrinkles appearing, jaw loosening. Some see a stranger where their reflection should be. Some see someone they recognize, a parent, a grandparent, a face they have not seen in decades. In 2010, an Italian psychologist named Giovanni Caputo at the University of Urbino ran exactly this experiment with 50 volunteers in a controlled laboratory setting. He documented their experiences afterward in the peer-reviewed journal Perception. What his participants described was remarkably consistent and remarkably disturbing. None of those 50 people were unstable. None were suggestible in any clinical sense. They were ordinary people, sitting in ordinary chairs, looking into ordinary mirrors. But here is the thing. The people who lived with antique mirrors, genuinely old mirrors, made before the 20th century, before the technology that makes your bathroom mirror so precise and flat and clear, they did not need a controlled experiment to experience this. They experienced it every day, because their mirrors were doing something that yours is not. This is the story of what old mirrors actually were, what they were made from, who made them, and what the science now tells us about why the people who looked into them saw what they saw. It begins on a small island in a lagoon in northern Italy, in a workshop that the Venetian government was willing to kill to protect. Act 1. The island of secrets, the island of Murano, sits in the Venetian lagoon, about 1.5 miles north of Venice itself. Today it is a tourist destination. Visitors arrive by water taxi to watch glass blowers at work, to buy ornaments and pendants and small decorative objects in the colours that Murano has been famous for across 5 centuries. It is a charming place. A gentle place. It was not always gentle. In the late 13th century, specifically around 1291, the Venetian Republic made a decision that would reshape European history in ways that nobody could have predicted at the time. They moved every glassmaker in Venice to Murano. The official reason given was fire safety. Glass furnaces burned at extreme temperatures, and in a city built largely of timber on a foundation of wooden piles, the risk of a furnace fire spreading to the surrounding streets was real. But fire safety was not the primary reason. The primary reason was control. Venice in the 13th century was one of the wealthiest trading cities on earth, and the technology of high-quality glass was at the heart of that wealth. The Venetian glassmakers had developed techniques that no one else in Europe understood, techniques for achieving a clarity in glass that approached the look of natural crystal, techniques for colouring glass with metallic oxides in ways that produced colours no other workshop could replicate. Those techniques were an economic secret of state-level importance. By moving all glassmakers to Murano, an island that could be monitored, controlled, whose comings and goings could be watched, the Venetian Republic ensured that those secrets stayed in Venice. The penalty for revealing them to a foreign power was not a fine. It was not imprisonment. It was death. The Cristallo revolution for most of the medieval period, glass, even good Venetian glass, had a greenish or brownish tint. The impurities in the raw sand used to make it gave it colour it couldn't shake. You could see through it, but what you saw was filtered, tinted, slightly wrong. Then, in the mid-15th century, a Murano glassmaker named Angelo Barovia changed everything. Barovia had been experimenting for years with a technique of purifying raw glass using manganese dioxide, a compound that essentially neutralized the iron and other impurities that gave ordinary glass its unwanted color. The result was a glass of extraordinary, almost shocking clarity. It looked, when held up to the light, less like glass and more like rock crystal, like a solid, transparent mineral pulled from the earth. He called it Cristallo. The news spread quickly. Murano's master craftsmen became Europe's exclusive mirror producers, and their Cristallo Veneziano glass captured the attention of nobility throughout the continent. The implications for mirrors were immediate. Before Cristallo, the clearest reflective surface available to most people was polished metal bronze, silver, occasionally steel. These gave a reflection, but a dim one, a dark one, an imprecise one. You could see roughly what you looked like, the way you might see yourself reflected in still water, but you could not see yourself clearly. With Cristallo, suddenly you could, or at least you thought you could, because even Cristallo was not what your bathroom mirror is, and that gap, that small but consequential gap, is at the heart of everything that follows. The mercury process making a mirror from Cristallo glass required one more step beyond simply making the glass itself. You needed to give it a reflective backing. The Venetian method, developed through the 16th century on Murano, refined over generations of closely guarded experimentation, involved applying a thin layer of a tin mercury amalgam to the back of the flattened glass. During the 16th century, inhabitants of the Venetian island of Murano used their famous Cristallo glass recipe to perfect a technique of mirror making that involved applying an amalgam of tin and mercury to the back of a smooth sheet of glass. The process required the glass to be blown, flattened while still soft, cooled carefully, then laid flat, while the tin-mercury mixture was spread across its surface. The mercury bonded to the tin bonded to the glass, and the result, once the amalgam had set, was a surface that reflected light with a quality that no polished metal mirror could match. For the first time in European history, you could stand before a full-length surface and see yourself reflected in something approaching photographic clarity. The effect on people who encountered these mirrors for the first time was, by contemporary accounts, genuinely disorienting. One Venetian document from the mid-16th century records a noblewoman seeing herself at full height in a Murano mirror for the first time, and being so startled by the precision of the reflection that she initially believed she was looking at another person standing behind the glass. She was not confused or simple. She was simply encountering a technology that had no precedent in her experience. The cost of a mirror. These mirrors were not everyday objects. Early Venetian mirrors that were made using all these techniques cost about as much as a ship. Let that settle for a moment. A single mirror. The price of a sea-going vessel. When King Henry VIII of England wanted a Murano mirror, and he did want one, as did most of the royal courts of Europe, it was a diplomatic as much as a commercial transaction. These objects were status symbols of the highest order. To own one was to demonstrate wealth, connections, and access to the most advanced technology in the world. The Venetian government understood this power perfectly. The Venetians kept the manufacturing secret and the exclusivity of production until the 17th century, and they defended it with a ruthlessness that the historical record documents clearly. In 1665, that defence became something darker than law or imprisonment. It became something that, if it happened today, we would call state-sanctioned assassination. The most dangerous secret in Europe, the Palace of Versailles, is one of the most photographed buildings on Earth. Its hall of mirrors, 357 mirrors lining a gallery 73 metres long, reflecting the gardens and the sky in an endless repetition of light, is the image most people carry when they think of the palace. It is magnificent. It was designed to be magnificent. Louis VI, the Sun King, understood that power communicated through architecture was power that didn't need to be spoken aloud. But in 1665, when Louis and his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, first began planning what would become Versailles, they had a problem. France could not make mirrors. Not mirrors of the quality they needed. Not mirrors that could fill the walls of the grandest royal palace in the world. For mirrors of that quality, you needed Murano. And Murano was in Venice. And Venice did not share its secrets. Colbert devised a plan to bribe and smuggle glassmakers away from the island. This was, in the language of the 17th century, industrial espionage, a criminal act in Venice, punishable by death. But France was a kingdom with its own logic, and Colbert was a man who was not easily deterred. He sent the French ambassador to Venice with instructions and a substantial amount of money. The ambassador made contact. Several Murano glassmakers, tempted by French promises of wealth, freedom, and permanent residence, agreed to leave the island in secret. They were smuggled out of Venice. They arrived in Paris. They began teaching French apprentices the tin-mercury amalgam process. Venice found out almost immediately. The Republic was so protective of their secret that after the defectors escaped to France, the government put their families in prison and even deployed assassins to poison the artisans. The sequence of events that followed is documented in the diplomatic correspondence of the period. In 1667, the most talented of the mirror polishers died in an agony of stomach pains he had been suffering from for several days. The Venetian ambassador's report was careful and ambiguous. It is not known whether he died naturally or not. 3 weeks later, the top glass blower also died in agony. 2 deaths, 3 weeks apart. Both men who had left Murano with French money in their pockets. Both men who knew the most commercially valuable manufacturing secret in Europe. Colbert ordered an autopsy on the second man. The result came back. Natural causes. The glass workers who remained had received the message intended and came to the realization that their choice of occupation was a little more dangerous than they had at first anticipated. They wrote to Venice asking for forgiveness and requesting money to return to Murano. Most of them went home, but enough of the secret had already been transferred. French apprentices had learned what they needed. The royal manufacture of mirrors on the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Antoine in Paris continued its work. By the 1680s, France could make mirrors, and the Hall of Versailles was filled with them, what those mirrors actually looked like now. Here is the thing that most histories of Murano mirrors skip over entirely. These mirrors, the ones that courts fought wars of espionage over, that Colbert's agents were poisoned for, that cost the price of a ship, were not like your bathroom mirror. They were beautiful. They were the finest reflective surfaces the world had ever produced. But they were not flat. They were not perfectly consistent. And they were not, in the modern sense, precisely accurate. The Cristallo glass, for all of Barovia's brilliance, retained microscopic variations in thickness across its surface. When you blew glass and flattened it, you could control the result with extraordinary skill, but you could not eliminate all variation. The resulting mirror surface had a very slight, very subtle waviness to it, barely perceptible in casual use, but present. The tin-mercury amalgam backing introduced another variable. Mercury, applied to tin in a semi-molten state, did not spread with perfect uniformity. As it set and cooled over years and decades, it would develop what conservators today call foxing small patches of tarnish, areas where the amalgam had oxidized or separated slightly from the glass. These patches appeared in the reflection as dark, cloudy areas, as slight distortions, as regions where your image rippled rather than reproduced cleanly. The edges of a Venetian mirror, in particular, tended to darken over time. Mercury oxidizes slowly but relentlessly. A mirror that had been in a family for 20 years had noticeably darker edges than a new one, and in a candlelit room, those dark edges created a natural vignette around the reflection, framing it in shadow, pulling it slightly away from reality. Add candles. Because that is the only light there was. Candlelight flickers, It is not constant. It does not illuminate evenly. It creates warm pools and deep shadows, and its movement is continuous and subtle and irregular. A face viewed in a mercury amalgam mirror by candlelight is a face seen in motion, not dramatically moving, but trembling, almost imperceptibly, with every flicker of every flame. This is the environment in which every person who ever owned one of these mirrors lived with it. Not under fluorescent light, not under the flat, even, shadowless illumination of a modern home. By candlelight, in a mirror made of slightly imperfect glass, backed with slowly tarnishing mercury. And what they saw in that mirror, what they regularly, consistently, documentably saw, has a scientific explanation that was only fully articulated in the 21st century. An explanation that tells us something genuinely unsettling about how the human brain processes a face. Any face, including its own. What the brain does in the dark in 2010, the Italian psychologist Giovanni Caputo published a paper in the journal Perception that described an experiment so simple and results so consistent that it raised an immediate question: if this effect is this reliable, this reproducible, this universal, why did it take until 2010 for anyone to run the experiment? The answer, of course, is that nobody needed to run the experiment until modern mirrors made the effect invisible. For the previous 5 centuries, if you wanted to know what happened when a person stared at a slightly imperfect reflective surface in low light for 10 minutes, you simply asked them. They would have told you. The experiment Caputo set up was straightforward. A room lit only by a dim lamp, 25 watts, placed behind the participant, a large mirror positioned about 40 centimeters from the sitter's face, instructions to gaze at their own reflected face without looking away. A 10-minute session, and afterward a written record of what each person had seen. 50 participants took part. In normal observers, gazing at one's own face in the mirror for a few minutes at a low illumination level triggers the perception of strange faces, a new visual illusion that has been named the strange face in the mirror. The effects his participants reported were remarkably consistent and remarkably striking. Some saw their own face age rapidly, decades appearing to compress into minutes, the reflection growing old before their eyes. Some saw their features distort, noses enlarging, foreheads expanding, jaws softening into unrecognizable shapes. Some saw a different face entirely, a stranger's face, where their own reflection should have been. And some the detail that Caputo's paper notes most carefully saw faces they recognized. Family members. Parents. People who had died. At the end of a 10-minute session of mirror gazing, participants were asked to write what they saw in the mirror. In low light levels, one participant saw the edges of their face blur and become highly bulbous. Another said, "I turned into my mother, who is still alive." The neuroscience what is actually happening here? The answer involves 2 separate but overlapping processes. The first is something called neural adaptation specifically, the adaptation of the visual neurons responsible for processing the specific features of a face. When you stare at anything without moving your gaze a color, a shape, a pattern, the neurons that respond to that specific stimulus gradually reduce their firing rate. They become habituated. The brain, in an attempt to save energy and filter out static information, essentially starts ignoring what isn't changing. When you stare at your own face in a mirror, the neurons that encode your specific facial features, the exact spacing of your eyes, the precise shape of your nose, the particular angle of your jaw begin to fatigue. Their signal weakens, and when a signal weakens, the brain does not simply receive less information. The brain fills in. It guesses. It constructs a version of what it expects to see, based on its library of stored faces. And stored faces are not just your face. They are every face you have ever known well. Every face you have looked at closely for long periods of time. the people you lived with, the people you loved, the people who are gone. The second process is called pareidolia. As humans, we are hardwired to discern recognizable and often meaningful patterns, a psychological phenomenon referred to as pareidolia. We see the face of an old man in the knots of a tree, the shape of an animal in the clouds, the man on the moon. The brain has a tendency to assign meaning wherever it can, and faces, human faces specifically, are the most meaning-loaded stimuli the brain encounters. We evolved to read faces with extraordinary sensitivity. A shadow that vaguely resembles two eyes above a horizontal smear will activate the face recognition system in the human brain almost reflexively, before conscious thought has had a chance to intervene. Now put these two processes together. Stare at your own face by candlelight in a slightly imperfect mercury mirror. The flickering light causes your image to tremble. The slight waviness of the old glass introduces distortions that shift and change as the candlelight moves. The imperfections in the amalgam create dark patches and light patches that aren't there in a modern mirror. Your visual neurons habituate, they tire, they start to fail, and your brain, faced with a trembling, distorted, imperfect image that no longer resolves into a stable, reliable representation of your own face, starts to pattern match. Desperately, automatically, below the level of conscious control, it looks for a face in what it's seeing, it finds one. But it might not be yours. This is not mystical, this is not a ghost. This is the brain doing exactly what the brain evolved to do, finding pattern, finding meaning, finding face in a set of conditions that its ancient hardware was never designed to navigate. And those conditions, the candlelight, the imperfect glass, the slowly oxidizing mercury, were the standard conditions of every household in Europe for 400 years. Every person who looked into one of these mirrors and saw something unexpected was experiencing a documented, reproducible, neurologically normal response to their physical environment. But not everyone who looked into an old mirror was doing so in their own home. Some of them were doing so in the court of the Queen of England, and one of them left a record of what he saw. The Queen's mathematician Anne the Black Mirror John Dee was born in London in 1527, and by any measure was one of the most remarkable minds of the 16th century. He had studied mathematics at Cambridge. He had lectured on Euclid at the University of Paris to standing room audiences. He owned one of the largest private libraries in England, more than 4,000 books at a time, when most educated households had fewer than a dozen. A Renaissance polymath whose interests ranged from astronomy to astrology, alchemy and mathematics. Dee advised Queen Elizabeth I from the start of her reign in 1558 to the 1570s. As court astrologer and scientific advisor, he advocated for overseas exploration and the establishment of colonies. He may, some historians have argued, have been one of the inspirations for Prospero the magician scholar in Shakespeare's The Tempest. He was also, in the later decades of his life, deeply interested in something that sat on a very uncertain border between natural philosophy and the supernatural. He wanted to speak to angels, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. He believed genuinely and apparently sincerely that intelligences existed beyond the physical world, and that with the right instrument and the right approach, those intelligences could be contacted. The instrument he chose was a mirror, not a Venetian mercury mirror. Something older, stranger, darker. The Aztec obsidian Spanish forces under Herne Courts conquered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1521. They quickly began shipping treasures back to Europe, including obsidian mirrors. Obsidian is volcanic glass formed when lava cools so rapidly that it solidifies before crystals can form. It is dense, hard, and when polished, intensely reflective, not with the warm silver clarity of a mercury mirror. With a deep, dark, cold reflectivity like looking into black water. For the Aztec civilization, obsidian mirrors were not decorative objects. They were sacred instruments associated with Tezcatlipoca, one of the most powerful deities in the Aztec pantheon, whose name translates as smoking mirror. Tezcatlipoca was the god of the night sky, of conflict, of change, and of the obsidian mirror through which he was said to see all things. In 1521, Spanish forces captured Montezuma, burned the city, and shipped plundered treasures, including gold, silver, jewels, and ceramics, back to Spain. Among these were what were considered curiosities, exotic bits and pieces that the wealthy could display in curio cabinets. The little obsidian mirror was passed from one estate to another. By the time it reached John Dee's hands, probably in Bohemia, in the 1580s it had travelled thousands of miles and changed hands many times, losing all record of its origins along the way. A spirit mirror believed to have been used by Queen Elizabeth I's famed political advisor John Dee was crafted in Aztec Mexico around 500 years ago, reinforcing the idea that the mirror was used by the Elizabethan occultist in his attempts to communicate with angels. This was confirmed in 2021 when researchers from the University of Manchester, using portable X-ray fluorescence scanning, identified the geochemical fingerprint of the obsidian as coming from the Pachuca region of central Mexico. The obsidian mirror associated with the Elizabethan polymath and magus John Dee has been an object of fascination for centuries. The mirror demonstrates how a complex cultural history underpins an iconic object. How Dee used it, Dee did not gaze into the mirror alone. He had a partner, a man named Edward Kelly, who served as what Dee called his scryer. Kelly would sit before the black obsidian surface in a dimly lit room, stare into it, and describe what he saw. Skilled seers like Kelly could enter a trance-like state, transcend barriers between the physical and spirit worlds, and concentrate occult rays. Kelly looked, saw, and recounted mysterious images and messages. Dee listened, scribed, and interpreted. Dee saw himself as akin to a prophet. God had chosen him to receive such messages, and he recorded them in angelic diaries. Those diaries still exist. Several are held in the British Library. They contain hundreds of pages of detailed transcripts, the words that Kelly reported the angel speaking, the visions he described seeing in the mirror's surface, the elaborate cosmological system that Dee assembled from those sessions over years of work. Now, what was actually happening? This is where the neuroscience and the history converge in a way that I think is more interesting than any supernatural explanation could be. An obsidian mirror is darker than a mercury glass mirror, much darker. Its reflectivity is lower. Your image in it is dim, shadowed, fragmented. The features that your visual system uses to stabilize a face, the precise edges of the nose, the whites of the eyes, the line of the mouth, are all slightly obscured, slightly uncertain. In a candlelit room, with that level of visual ambiguity, the strange face effect that Giovanni Caputo would describe in his 2010 paper would have been not less pronounced, but more. The brain, deprived of the stable facial information it needed, would have pattern matched more aggressively. The faces it found would have been less anchored to Kelly's own features, more freely generated from his memory and imagination, and Edward Kelly was whatever else, he was a man with a powerful imagination, working for a brilliant and demanding employer who needed visions. The British Museum acquired John Dee's obsidian mirror in 1966. It is now on display in the institution's Enlightenment Gallery. You can go and look at it. It sits in a glass case, dark and quiet, far from the candlelit rooms of Mortlake and Prague where Kelly stared into it and reported angels. I wonder sometimes what Kelly actually saw. Not what he told Dee he saw, what he actually saw. The neuroscience suggests it would have been vivid. It would have been faces shifting and morphing and changing identity with the flickering of the candle. Faces that felt, in the low-lit intimacy of that room, as though they were looking back. The pattern across 4 centuries let me pull these threads together, because I think the pattern that emerges is genuinely remarkable. For 400 years, from the moment Barovia invented Cristallo on, Murano in the mid-15th century to the moment silver glass mirrors began replacing mercury amalgam mirrors in the late 19th century, every person in Europe who owned a mirror was looking into a surface with specific optical properties. Slightly imperfect glass, slowly tarnishing amalgam, dark edges, cloudy patches, subtle waviness, and they were viewing that surface by the only light available: fire, candles, torches, oil lamps, light that moves, that flickers, that creates shadow and warmth and irregular illumination. Under those conditions, which the neuroscience now demonstrates clearly, the human brain does not produce a stable, accurate reflection of a face. It produces something more complex, something that shifts and changes, something that can age a face or transform it or replace it entirely with a face from memory. Now consider what that means for the history of how people related to mirrors. The superstitions that accrued around mirrors across European cultures, the belief that breaking a mirror brought 7 years of bad luck, the covering of mirrors in a house of mourning, the vampire who casts no reflection, the belief that a mirror could reveal your fate or show you a supernatural visitor, none of these emerged from nowhere. They emerged from people's actual, consistent, neurologically documented experience with the objects they owned. When a woman in 16th century Venice covered the mirrors in her house after a death in the family, she was not simply following a superstition handed down from ancestors. She was responding to something she had genuinely experienced, the tendency of a mercury mirror in low light to show, in the place of her own face, a face she recognized from the past. When ancient magical traditions across multiple cultures, Greek, Roman, Celtic, and later Renaissance, described mirrors as gateways or windows to other states of reality. They were not inventing fiction. They were codifying a consistent pattern of experience that anyone with access to a reflective surface in a dimly lit room could reproduce. The mirror was not magic. The brain was the magic. The mercury irony there is one more piece to this. The glassmakers of Murano, who spent their working lives applying tin mercury amalgam to glass sheets, were not simply craftsmen engaged in a physically demanding trade. They were poisoning themselves. Mercury vapor is neurotoxic. Chronic exposure produces tremors, cognitive impairment, sensory disturbances. Personality changes the cluster of symptoms that gave rise to the phrase "mad as a hatter," because hat makers of the same era used mercury in their felt curing process. The Murano mirror makers, who spent years in workshops permeated with mercury vapor, were, in the later stages of their careers, men whose neurological systems were being slowly compromised. The very craftsmen who made the mirrors that produced strange face illusions in their customers were themselves experiencing neurological changes that would have altered their own visual perception. History does not record what those men saw when they looked into their own product, but it is not difficult to imagine. The glass that remembers the next time you walk past an antique mirror, in a museum, in an antique shop, in an old house, I want you to look at it carefully. Not at your reflection, at the mirror itself. Look at the edges, where the amalgam has darkened over decades or centuries. Look at the slight cloudiness in the body of the glass, where the mercury has oxidized in patches. Look at the very subtle unevenness in the surface, the way the reflection of a straight line bends almost imperceptibly, the way your face in it is not quite the face you see in your bathroom every morning. This is not a damaged mirror. This is what a mirror was. This is the surface that every ancestor you have, going back 10 generations, used to look at themselves. The surface they combed their hair in, checked their clothing in, examined their own faces in as they aged. And sometimes by candlelight, in a quiet room, when the light was low and the hour was late, the surface showed them something they did not expect. something that the science now explains completely, something that their culture could only explain as a visitation, a prophecy, a window into elsewhere. They were not wrong to be shaken by it. The strange face illusion is real. The neuroscience is documented. The psychology of pareidolia is peer-reviewed. But knowing the mechanism doesn't quite remove the experience. If you do try the candle experiment tonight, the one I described at the very beginning of this episode, I would be curious to know what you see. Leave it in the comments, because 400 years of antique mirrors have produced a remarkably consistent pattern of human experience. And you are part of the same species that experienced it then. Your brain has the same hardware. The dark, the candle, and the glass will do the rest. This has been the Vertical Archive. We find the things that were hiding in plain sight. We will see you next